One nurse, when I first started, said to me, "Oh, we need to train you because you're getting taken advantage of and you need to learn, the tricks." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "First rule is never make contact with a patient, eye contact." I was horrified because that was why I was there.
Hi, welcome back to Humans of Healthcare. We're back with Ann Richardson. She's been so gracious to come to town and spend more time doing as many podcasts as we could fit in on as many topics. So today we're going to hit on a topic that kind of goes back into Ann's past. It's going to bring up a lot of different topics, but it does give you the essence of why Ann got into the world that she's in, how she became the administrator that she became. And it started with an experience with her family member. And Ann's kind of like me. I think a lot of people who probably have been in management or just a lot of people in general that I know, that if there's a hole in a dam and it's springing leaks, we go put our finger in that hole and do everything that we can to fix the problem, and to our detriment sometimes, right? So when you think about this next episode in our conversation, just think about how you got into what you're doing, and if it ever was a situation where you found a problem that you just started to fix, and then the problems get bigger and more holes start to pop, so you start putting your fingers in different sections of the dam. So it's with that I want to kind of bring back that story that you and I were talking about, when you had a family member that had an emergency and needed to go to the ER, and then what that all turned into you. And then also, how does that kind of translate into where you are today with what you're doing? Is there this correlation between that experience and how profound it was to what you're doing today?
So the scenario was, I was actually my undergrad was healthcare administration.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a new healthcare administrator, but not in a leadership role yet. And I had a family member that had a head injury from doing something foolish uh, at home and was advised not to, but did it. And it resulted in a forehead injury that, if I recall, it ended up with like 38 stitches.
Wow.
So it bled quite a bit.
Good size, yeah.
So 911 called, the rescue ambulance comes, bandages it up and says you need to go to the hospital. Refused ambulance ride and said, "I'll be fine, and you can drive me." And so anyway, put him in the car, drove to the hospital, which was maybe about a 20-minute drive. This was on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, for those watching. It was we had two hospitals at the time, and this was in the summer. So the summer, Cape Cod is a resort area, high tourism. So much like certain other regions of the country, Florida, snowbirds and whatnot, we have a very high surge of patients.
Sure.
Patient demand, and that emergency at the time was one of the busiest in the state of Massachusetts.
Makes
during
sense.
that time.
Yeah.
So long story short, drive him to the emergency room, bleeding profusely. Very stoic person who doesn't complain, was very quiet, and I'll be okay. So I wasn't worried so much that he wasn't going to be okay, but the bleeding just wouldn't
Kept
stop,
coming.
and
Yeah.
we couldn't contain the bleeding. Get to the emergency room, get to the curb, and somebody comes out and sees us. We're able to grab a wheelchair because at this point he was losing, not losing consciousness, but was weak.
Yeah.
And so
faint.
put him in a wheelchair and seemed to be waiting in the waiting room for the longest time. No one even triaged us. And he started to feel nauseous and like he was going to lose consciousness. So he had me bring him over to like a corner where I remember was kind of out of the way of the waiting room to just lay down on the floor. And now I'm panic going, well, this is crazy. Earlier, as a teenager, I was a volunteer at this hospital, so I knew one of the environmental services men who'd been there for years. I knew him by name, and he remembered me, so I asked him if he could help. So we got him up into the wheelchair, and he got him through triage, and then he went behind the doors, and I didn't see him for a long while. And so when he came out, his head was bandaged and he had stitches, and I get him in the car and I, get him home, and he tells me the story of what a horrible experience it was. This was not a person who was a wimpy, high maintenance person who would
Complainer.
complain, just
Yeah.
patch me up, I'm on my
Sure.
way.
Sure.
And I said, what happened? And he said, I was freezing cold because of the air conditioning, but with the bleeding. And he had shorts on and he had a t-shirt on and it was soaking wet from blood and whatnot.
Wow.
And he was really cold. And he said, all I wanted was a blanket, but nobody would look at me. And he said, it was as if it was intentional. And I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I would try to call out. And so long story short, he said it wasn't a good experience. And so because I had volunteered there before, at this point, I'm living on Cape Cod, but I'm commuting for work to Boston.
Oh.
And I'm working in an academic medical center in Boston, and I'm commuting. And so I contacted the hospital and asked them, they knew who I was. I gave them my name. I said I would like to come back and I would like to volunteer, but I would like to volunteer on a late Friday night or a Saturday in the emergency room. And they said, wow, that's specific. And I said, why? They said, why? I said, well, because I had a family member that had a bad experience, and I would like an opportunity. I'm only one person for the evening shift, especially in the summer in Cape Cod, to be there, to be that extra pair of hands, just to do comfort measures so that a person doesn't have to go through what my family member did. And they said, okay.
Wow.
And so I did that, and the shifts were 4 hours. And so nonetheless, I got in, and it became quickly apparent that the nurses viewed me as, a volunteer who was going to provide comfort measures and stuff, and all that was great. But one nurse, when I first started, said to me, oh, we need to train you because you're getting taken advantage of and you need to learn, the tricks. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, first rule is never make contact with a patient, eye contact. And I said, I was horrified because that was why I was there.
Right.
So I said, and I didn't want to challenge her. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, oh, if you look at them, they will ask you for things. I said, but they're patients. Why wouldn't they? So again, I didn't resist. I just absorbed that, and I have never forgotten. I still remember the names of those people.
Oh my gosh.
So my job was to provide comfort measures. So I would get warm blankets. I would also often refill portable oxygen tanks. I would often be a runner for supplies.
Mm-hmm.
It was at night, and so I would be the off hours person that had to go to their supply, or even pharmacy. Maybe had to pick up IV solutions, whatever the case may be. But in addition, when I first got there, it was like something out of a horror movie. I'll never forget it. Friday night, Saturday night, Cape Cod Hospital. I would get there after 6 p.m. The bays, the holding areas were loaded with patients that had already been admitted from an electronic standpoint and clinical, but there was nobody to transport them. And so they were non-telemetry patients that a volunteer was allowed to just literally bring their stretcher with their belongings up the elevator to the inpatient beds. And so it was always a mad dash. It wouldn't be unusual to have 8 or more of those patients waiting when I would come in at the start of my shift.
Wow.
And so that would be the first thing I would do. But I would do it respectfully, so it wasn't like a race, and the patients didn't feel slighted. But what I would observe is that as soon as I would get in the elevator and the doors were shut, then they would tell me stories. Oh my God. And they would tell me how, this is decades ago. Okay, decades ago.
Okay.
This is not COVID, this is decades ago. Oh my God, it was as if, and I never shared with them the truth, but they said it was as if they were ignoring me. Nobody would look at me. Oh, I'm so sorry that happened. It was a busy night in the summer. I would try to tell them that was an aberration when I knew it wasn't.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was, when I would come in, they would ask me for something to drink, which of course I wasn't allowed to do. I'd have to ask the nurse in case they were NPO.
Sure.
They would say, oh, no, that patient can't have fluids, or no, that patient can have cranberry juice, apple, whatever. So then once I would go down the line with sometimes 8 stretchers in a row, all waiting to be admitted, they would all like sit up like it was something like out of a horror movie, all waiting for their drink. And then they would tell me in the elevator how long it had been. And they were so thirsty. And again, I didn't let on how sad I was, but I was sad.
Yeah.
And so, you'd get them admitted. And when I say get them admitted, I just transported them.
Sure.
But I would, make sure that they were, properly transported with the nurses. Then I would take the stretcher back to the ED because that's where it needed to be returned. But, and then there were a couple of other incidents. One that stands out in my mind. There are always those instances that you stay with you. The faces, the names, the sound, the smell, whatever.
Yep.
Was a man, maybe he was in his 60s, I don't know, but he was petrified, and he was in one of the first bays when you come through the door, screen open, brought in for a rule out of MI for a heart attack. And he was very scared. And the nurse said to him, well, if I were you, I would, and your family, I would get to Boston. I wouldn't want to be here if I had a cardiac issue.
Oh,
so
my.
I happened to know who he was going to see because I knew this doctor clinically and professionally.
Wow.
And and he was petrified. And so he took my hand, and he was scared. And I told him not to worry. I called his doctor by name. I said, I know who your doctor is. I said, he's a wonderful, wonderful doctor, very well respected. You're in great hands, which he was. But I'm thinking to myself, that nurse, now I felt powerless at the time,
Sure.
even though I worked in healthcare.
Sure.
And I was a volunteer, but I felt like because I was a volunteer, and the nurses definitely treated me like Cinderella, like I was the person that they gave the stuff they didn't want to do, which I was fine because actually that's why I'm here. So when they would ask me, I'd say, look, that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here to do the non-nursing comfort measures, so please don't hesitate. And they didn't. And so that's what I did because I wanted them to focus on nursing.
Sure.
But I always felt challenged that I wasn't able to go back to that nurse who said that.
I was wondering what you might, like if you could today, what would you do in that circumstance?
Well, I mean, today and many, few years after that and then on, I certainly was in a situation where I could, and I wouldn't say it with the patient there and wouldn't say it in a reprimanding punitive, but would definitely have a conversation about how inappropriate and how, harsh that is and how scary that is for the patient.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because that hospital system today, since I already put it out that it was Cape Cod Hospital, has an open heart surgery program. They, were approved to do cardiac catheterizations. They have a pretty extensive cardiovascular service line. Now, there are certain things they don't do. Mm-hmm. Certain patients with certain comorbidities may be airlifted to Boston, but they do a lot of invasive cardiology procedures. It started with that physician that this man was going to see.
Oh, there you go.
On the non-invasive side, but
sure.
But the point was, I knew that strategy and that vision, and got to know that this was the direction. So I was thinking to myself, how even if it wasn't, you don't say that to a patient.
No, I know. It's just there's so many things that come to my mind, and I'm the business side, so it's like. Messaging's a really big deal. And, for that nurse to have received that message, one of two things: either she received the message and it wasn't the right message, or she received the right message and she took it upon herself to lie to somebody. Right. But either way, you got a situation on your hands. You got to figure out which one is it. And if she's lying to this patient, it's like, why? Well, that's pretty nasty to do that to a patient, to get them into that state where they're scared. When, but I was also intrigued by what you were just saying a few minutes ago about there's this code where all the patients that you were transporting somehow knew not to say anything and yell out for what they needed. Like it's like they've just adapted to the surroundings and the environment having only been there for a little bit of time, they just knew that nobody looking them in the eye and all the stuff that you described, they couldn't say anything. They felt sort of paralyzed, and then they get one opportunity with you and the floodgates open. But there was an unspoken thing in the ER, right? Like, it's just,
Well, in that particular ER, in that scenario, they were lined up in an area that
I
was like
got
a
you.
holding area for admission.
Okay.
So they'd already been triaged, they'd already been seen by an attending, already been seen by consulting physicians who may have come in, pulmonary critical care, whatever the case may be. And so now they were in a bay to be admitted, and they just needed somebody to transfer them.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
So they would be quiet at that point, just saying, God, I hope I get a bed soon.
Yeah.
And in this case, different today, it wasn't because there wasn't a bed. They didn't have a person to transport them.
Oh, wow.
And so that ended up being a big part of my function.
Sure.
But there were beds.
Yeah, I got
So
you.
there wasn't a bed capacity
Wow.
then. It was just a matter of, cleaning up. And I used to love the fact that within, say, 30 minutes or so, those 8 patients would be in a bed somewhere.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so now it would be empty to start the shift
Yeah.
when it got really busy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So like a little throughput issue like that, right, created this log jam, that had effects on the patients, obviously, and then
Right.
even the nurses. I can imagine that their anxiety goes up seeing those patients waiting to be transferred.
And the nurses still had responsibility for those patients as
Yeah.
long as they were in their unit.
Right.
So even though they'd been potentially diagnosed and they've been admitted, they're still on their unit. And so
Yeah.
the nurses now have all the other bays that are full with new patients coming in, right?
Yeah.
That they're caring for.
Yeah.
And they have all these patients as well.
Yeah.
So even though they're not, some of them did have, IVs and medication and whatnot. They weren't on telemetry monitors, but
Sure.
they still needed to provide the care.
Okay.
But the patients, as you can imagine, depending on their physical state and their mental state, they tend to be quiet, and they're like, okay, this too shall pass. I'm going to be in a bed soon, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be out of here. And they were also told that they were going to be admitted. Now today, that would be a different story. They knew they were admitted, but maybe that bed that they're in is that bed. Maybe it is in the hallway. Maybe it is in the ED. So today it's a very, very different environment. But what was interesting is that I shared that story because when people talk about, junior nurses coming in and
Mm-hmm.
the old, expression of eat their young, it still exists today.
Sure.
It still very much exists, but I found that those particular nurses that I felt were a little on the rude side, cold or harsh, they were all young. They were not senior nurses. I was in my 20s, and so were they.
Yeah. That's interesting.
And I'm thinking, where is this coming from?
Yeah. Yep.
And some of them I knew.
Yeah.
Some of them I knew personally.
Wow.
And they went to the best nursing schools. They were BSNs.
Wow.
And they were very, very smart people.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, it just... and they were asking me questions because the ones that knew me, I can think of 2 off the top of my head, what my... because they knew I started out as a BSN.
Okay.
And I changed
Yep.
majors after 2 years because I said, while I still am passionate about the clinical aspects of medicine and healthcare, I felt that I could, and what they didn't know, I didn't say, today I would have, is that even having that experience is what inspired me to go into the administrative side.
Okay.
Because I felt that I would have more of an ability to invoke positive change and also be able to support building the proper infrastructure for safer care.
Yeah.
And it wasn't meant to be, but that volunteer experience actually turned out to be a learning journey for me and an experiment of how not to treat patients.
Yeah. That's a great way to learn, seeing how not to do something. Like, this way I learned in management, frankly, is I don't ever want to be treated that way, and I would never do that to other people. But I think it's, it's interesting that when you and I talk about what you do today, there's a lot of those mainstays in there where you'll go courier something for somebody. You'll build relationships with people in those roles based off of your willingness to go do things that might seem minuscule to others, but you think of them as powerful in relationship building and for patient satisfaction. You know, like I imagine if these patients that you're talking about that you transported were queried and surveyed, that, you know, if at that moment would probably have something not so nice to say, and how such a simple thing could make such a big difference. And you go do those. I mean, you would in later in your career, the way you describe it to me, you would go do those simple things that seem minuscule but are so meaningful to the actual, whether it's a staff, you know, nurse, doctor, you still do them. Patients, you still do these things. It's amazing.
Well, and because I always recognized early on, and I still believe this today, is that there's so much value in helping.
Yeah. Yeah.
And respecting the people that you work with and so forth. And no matter how many years of experience we have, things evolve and things change and we learn.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
you learn a new process, you learn a new clinical modality comes out. And so with that, you kind of see people teaming up to do various things. And there's always an opportunity, outside pair of eyes, to look at it and say, wow, that's interesting. And have you thought of this, like, you know, from a process or, you know, a system standpoint?
Sure.
Because often when we see things, you know, slip through the cracks, I won't say a failure, but when we see things not executed and the result not as what expected, oftentimes it can be a system issue. So I look at it through the lens of what could we do if you look at the root cause analysis.
Sure.
And so, yeah, you get great joy of helping. And that is the reason. That's your primary reason. But on the other hand, you learn so much.
Sure.
You learn so much. And, you know, healthcare is very reactive.
Yeah, I was going to say
We've
that.
talked about this before, but
Yep.
it's just like everything's a 911
Yep.
reactive. And unfortunately, the way communication and messaging is conveyed can often be like firing squad,
Sure.
you know, like mandating and punitive and so forth, like that clip we talked about.
Yeah.
It's sad because
Yeah.
if we had relationships with people, just like in a, you know, personal relationship, if it's so built, if the foundation is so trusted and so respectful, you should be able to deliver the good, the bad, and the ugly, and be able to work together on making things better or celebrating the goodness because you all feel such a bond.
Sure.
That, you know, we're in this together.
Yeah. No, and the systemization piece I think is interesting because I, from my seat, I see a lot of people who don't know how to take ownership, right? So they see doing tasks. Their world is about completing tasks and following systems. But it feels like in my world, I don't know if this is going to transfer and cross over to healthcare or not, and actually, you know, clinical work, but or your administrative work, frankly, is like, what are tasks that people follow and where are there opportunities for people to take ownership and understand why the task exists the way that it does, why the system is built the way that it is? Is there some people that just get it and some people who take ownership and some people don't? Like, how do you adjust to the mix of different attitudes towards whatever those people are doing? And ownership keeps coming to mind for some reason, that word. If somebody would just take ownership of why they're doing what they're doing, it might have a better outcome and might give more ideas to people like you on how to make it better, because you're not the only one that can. There's no way you're the only one that can see these things. Somebody else has to be seeing that something's broken. And I just wonder why aren't they doing something about it sometimes?
Yeah, but sometimes it's a function of, in human nature, when we're, you know, spread thin.
Yeah.
And limited resources, time and people.
Yeah.
We're going to default to what we know.
Sure.
And a lot of people admit, I know it's not perfect, but it's the best we have right now, and this is what we're going to do.
Right.
And having that moment to pause and kind of look at the process, let's say, is not something that a lot of people in healthcare are afforded.
Yeah.
And so that's why I often say that when we have so many constraints, I always am the person that likes to be creative and innovative, not for the sake of being a cowboy that's like, oh, we're going to, you know, shake things up. We're just going to do this for the sake of change. No, but what we have isn't perfect. It gets us by, but we could do better. So what are our opportunities to make it better. And so when we look at what challenge are we looking to solve, the challenge might be, well, we have diminished access, or we have, diminished revenue. We're not collecting what we should be, right?
Yeah.
And so somebody may say, well, that's kind of vulgar to talk about money. Well, no, actually it's not, because that's how we're going to pay for more nurses
Yeah.
and more
For
equipment
sure.
and
For sure.
the resources that we need. So we must make sure that if our people are working as hard as they are, that they're not just churning, that
Yeah.
they're actually producing an opportunity for us to give back. And how
Yeah.
do we give back? It may be compensation, benefits, more resources and staff, and so forth. So
Sure.
we always have to keep our eye on the revenue stream.
Sure. Sure.
And but people, and this includes management as well, but especially the people right at point of care,
Uh-huh.
they don't have time to step back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the sad thing is that's where a lot of the ideas come from.
Yeah.
A lot of the innovations come from the people that do the work.
Yeah.
And so that's why, if you look at a systems approach and you look at, apply the 80-20 rule and say, okay, we're going to focus on, the 20%, and then we're going to look at those areas. And of that, we, depending on the resources of a system and the management team and the clinical team, you may say, let's just say it's the emergency department.
Uh-huh.
You may say, let's do, I hate to use the word project because that's another F word in healthcare.
Right.
As soon as someone says committee or project, they're like, oh my God,
Yeah.
another one.
Yeah.
It just gives people an excuse to sit in a meeting, every week, and what are we going to get done?
Yeah.
But if you talk to those people,
Yeah.
somehow find a time of day or when they're not working, but not make it so that it's a burden to them to come in on a day off, but, compensate for their time and their ideas, they'll tell you what's wrong.
They will.
And then they'll not only tell you what's wrong, but they'll probably give you some excellent ideas of how we can smooth out the flow and resolve it. And it isn't always just pay us more.
Yeah.
Oftentimes when people share stories, it's very rare they bring up their compensation.
Yeah.
Very rare.
Yep.
It's more, we need more resource. We need more of us.
Sure.
We need more nurses. We need more social workers. We need more attendings and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And less of you.
Yeah. 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 Well,
Meaning the non-clinical direct patient care providers. And I'd agree with them on that, because
Yeah.
I do think there's some bloat in the system. But it does take a team, and my role always was to take the ideas that they had and respectfully kind of brainstorm with them about, hey, yeah, that's a great idea, but what about this? Like, maybe take it a step further.
Sure.
Or I've had conversations with team members and say, oh my God, why didn't you tell me that sooner? That's a great idea. I hadn't have time.
Yeah.
And you know what? You asked the right question. You came at the right time. And I'd be like, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So that's always a reminder
Yeah.
that you need to be available and inquisitive and kind of, not ask questions in a, and I never was one that was accused of this, but you don't want to come in and ask questions like you're second guessing what they're doing.
Right. Right. Right.
You want to ask questions that
Yeah.
are more like open-ended of what do they think,
Yeah.
what are their ideas, and then, do some more work on it, whether it's with yourself or a team behind the scenes, or then come back to them.
Yeah, your technique in the ask is important for sure. I think when I think about the comment I just made about ownership, it's not that black and white. You're right, because there's so many things that maybe they are taking ownership, they have the right attitude, but like you said, there's not enough time, right? There's not enough of an opportunity. And I think about myself, in all fairness, like I just want to think sometimes. I just need time to think and communicate, and when I don't get that, I'm not very good in some cases.
Well, but think of clinical folks on the front lines.
Oh my gosh, I can't.
They don't even have time in many
It's so different. Yeah.
organizations, and in many units, they don't have proper breaks
Yeah.
or breakers at all.
Yeah.
For bathroom breaks, eating breaks, and whatnot. So if you were to come in and say, that they need creative, depending on how you catch someone, I mean, the reaction can be
Visceral.
pretty hostile,
Sure.
but appropriately so.
Sure.
The environments today in many organizations, not all, because not all that way, but there's a lot of resentment towards the folks that aren't taking care of patients, who have a whole lot to say about
Yeah, I bet.
the decision makers on behalf of those that are taking care of patients.
bet.
And again, some of those decision makers are clinical folks themselves,
Yeah,
or at
yeah.
least by license they are, or training, or initials after their name, but they maybe haven't cared for a patient in years.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of resentment
I bet.
from folks on the front line in those types of organization.
I bet. We'll end it there. Thank you for that, like reminiscing and going into your background. I think it's really important that
There are some stories like that will never leave me. Like I said,
bet.
the names of those nurses and faces and comments that were made in the scenario, I could draw it today very vividly.
Well, thanks, Ann. Good to talk to you again.
Thank you.
We'll see everybody on the next one.
Hey, this is your host, Danny Mobley. Thanks for watching Humans of Healthcare. Please subscribe below for more great interviews.